Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are going to go ahead and get started with some very basic housekeeping essentials for Adobe Connect and how this webinar works. So I will turn it over to Joshana to kind of go over those steps and what you guys need to know.
Good afternoon, guys. This is Joshana Clemens, and I am the administrator of Adobe Connect. If you have not seen this platform before, welcome. I just want to go over a few key housekeeping things before you guys get started. I'm only going to talk about the 4 boxes along the lines of your presentation. The first box is the attendee box, and that's where you are. Welcome again. Under that box, it says click to select eval. In a minute, you will see a link, and when you click and select that link, it will take you to SurveyMonkey, and you will be able to fill out the level 1 evaluation that we would actually need you to fill out, so we'll know how to best train you in the future. The box under that, when it's clicked to select files, that file, if you click on it, is the PDF version of your presentation today, and all you would do is click on that file and follow the prompts. The most important box for you guys under the click to select files, the last box is type your questions here. That box, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, you will enter that in that box, and we will answer you as appropriately and respectfully as we can. You all have a great meeting. Again, welcome to Adobe Connect, and I hope to see you again. Back to you, Michaela.
Thank you so much, Joshana. So again, welcome to today's webinar on duplication of benefits. This is our second to last webinar in our CDBG-DR and Mitigation Summer Series. So if you're joining us for the first time, we've been conducting a series of webinars to cover topics that will provide our grantees resources to help you successfully and compliantly implement your recovery programs. So please join us on Thursday for our very last webinar, which is covering engagement and coordination. For today's agenda, we will be providing an overview of DOB with an emphasis on exclusions and exceptions and giving you guys some complex examples. We will also walk you through the steps and considerations for aligning your DOB policies and procedures with the 2019 DOB notice in June of 2019. And we'll make the distinction between each disaster class to kind of help you guys understand what applies. We will also briefly discuss recapture and some general best practices of DOB and recapture policies, as well as what to expect when HUD is coming to monitor for your DOB. My name is Michaela Catani, and I am a CPD specialist up at HUD headquarters in the policy unit. And joining me today for this webinar is our Assistant Director, Jen Carpenter, who's our Assistant Director of Policy, also at HUD headquarters, and Carrie Whitehead, who is from our Office of General Counsel, also at headquarters with us. So let's jump into our overview of DOB. What is a DOB? I'm sure this is not the very first time you guys are hearing or seeing this term, but we want to start with a definition. So a duplication of benefits can occur when a person, household, business, government, or other entity is receiving assistance from multiple sources, all for the same purpose, where our total assistance received is more than what the need is. And this is really why we put so much emphasis on what is the unmet need when we're talking about CDBG-DR and our programs. This next slide, slide 8, is really just a visual of what that definition is saying. So it's just kind of showing you DOB can occur when assistance is coming from multiple sources and when the total assistance received is greater than what the need is. Yeah. And then where are our DOB sources and where are these requirements coming from? So first and foremost, DOB is in Section 312 of the Stafford Act. And then each CDBG-DR and CDBG-MIT Appropriations Act has corresponding Federal Register notices that also discuss DOB and the applicable requirements that a grantee must certify to demonstrate to HUD that its DOB policies are adequate. And then lastly, we have our OMB Cost Principles. So we'll kind of go over how cost principles come in and what to consider when applying them. So first, as we mentioned, there are different appropriation acts and different relevant Federal Register notices published by HUD that speak to DOB. So our very first one is published on November 16th in 2011, which is really only going to be applicable to some of you guys, right? So then in June of 2019, the department published a new notice that supersedes that 2011 notice. And we often refer to that as our 2019 DOB notice. And so that's how, we'll kind of refer to it, and you'll see in our materials just the shorthand of it. And then to help guide which requirements apply, HUD also published a 2019 DOB implementation notice on June 20th of 2019. And this implementation notice is only applicable to the 2015, 16, and 17 disaster classes. And this is really because HUD released this new DOB guidance after those grantees have already begun implementing its recovery program. So for our newer grantees, our 2018 and 2019 class, you guys don't have to worry about the implementation notice or the 2011 notice. Your notice is the 2019 DOB notice. OMB Cost Principles. So again, this slide is really just trying to explain what the cost principles are and where you can go to find more information. And we really want to make sure that you guys understand this piece and when it comes into play. So later on in this presentation, Carrie is going to highlight this concept through an example. But generally, when you're thinking necessary, put yourself in the mindset of, is this eligible? Is there a need for this type of disaster recovery assistance? Is this related to the disaster recovery assistance and purposes that I want to address in my CDBG-DR program? And then when you're thinking reasonable, be thinking, what would a prudent person consider the cost to be payable or reasonable? And now I will give this presentation over to Jen Carpenter to explain a little bit more about exclusions and exceptions and how you can align your policies and procedures to that 2019 DOB notice.
All right, thanks, Michaela. Hello, everyone. So we're going to first touch on, Michaela talked about what a DOB is, so let's talk about what's not a DOB. We all know the basic premise that if funds were given, if funds were given for a different purpose, they are not a duplication of benefits. I think that's the easiest one. We all understand that one. The next one is it's not a DOB if the funds were given for the same purpose, but a different allowable use. So that one can be a little confusing when you see it, but think about it in terms of who the funding source is and what restrictions they put on that funding source. So the example we give in the 2019 DOB notice is we talk about FEMA giving assistance for housing. And if they didn't restrict that housing assistance to, let's say, only housing rehab, but instead allow a variety of uses for those funds, something like interim housing, if the applicant used those funds for interim housing and you're running a housing rehab program, then while the funds are both for housing, they have different allowable uses. So if the applicant was allowed to and use those funds for interim housing, you have rehab funds. Those are not a duplication of benefits. Next, we have funds that are not available to the applicant, and that just means the applicant doesn't have legal control over the funds. Maybe if they were funds given to a previous owner, maybe an owner who has deceased, and so the applicant never had legal control over those funds. We also want to talk about private loans not being a DOB, so those are loans that are not provided or guaranteed or subsidized in any way by the government. And then any personal assets or lines of credit that an applicant takes out would also not be a DOB. And then we split those into exceptions and exclusions. So the exceptions are going to be funds not available, which would include declined or canceled subsidized loans. And so we're going to talk about that in the next slide. So we'll go into declined loans, we'll go into canceled loans, subsidized loans specifically. And then, as I mentioned, the private loans, so loans not guaranteed by the government, and any sort of lines of credit or personal assets that the applicant has. Maybe they use, maybe they pulled out of their retirement account to pay some costs. That's a personal asset. That is not, that's an exception from this DOB analysis. So then we move to exclusion. So what do you exclude when you're doing the DOB analysis? You're going to exclude, as I just mentioned, funds for a different purpose, and then funds for the same purpose, different allowable use. So it's just the wording that we're using when we're talking about these types of things. Just think about it as the top bucket are exceptions and the bottom bucket are exclusions. And that just kind of helps when you're doing the math and you're walking through examples. You just kind of want to listen for those words when Carrie's talking about her examples too. All right, declined loans. So we've talked about this several times. If you've listened to the DOB webinars we've recorded in the past, just to go over it one more time, the difference between a declined loan from HUD's perspective and a canceled loan. So a declined loan is when an applicant applied for the funds and the SBA said, yes, you're approved for this loan, but the applicant never signed any paperwork. They never signed the loan agreements. So they basically declined that loan by not signing those loan agreements. So that's a declined loan. A canceled loan is when the borrower did sign the loan agreement. So they applied for a loan, they got the loan, they signed all the loan documents, but for a variety of reasons decided to either cancel the loan, all of the loan, so they never drew down any funds, or they drew down some of the funds and canceled the rest. So maybe they drew down half the loan, left half of it undispersed. And so those are no longer available to the applicant. But we just have to, there has to be some documentation there to prove that, right? And so we'll talk about that a little bit. Also covered in the notice, which we don't mention a whole lot when we do this, but remember DOB applies to everybody. It applies to grantees, it applies to subrecipients, and applicants. So we tend to think about it, and I apologize for the barking background if folks can hear that, but we tend to think about it only for our applicants, but it applies to grantees too. So remember that it is, if a grant allows a grantee or a subrecipient to do reimbursement, with most of our notices do allow that. If you take out a subsidized short-term loan to pay for eligible costs before the funds are available, the reimbursement of those costs are not a duplication. All right, so let's talk a little more about declined loans. If a grantee is unable to determine if an applicant has declined a loan, you're still going to need some kind of paperwork, right? we all know you have to document this stuff, and sometimes it's difficult, especially in the case of a decline loan where the applicant just never signed the loan paperwork. So in that case, the best way might to just obtain a written self-certification from the applicant that states they never accepted or received the loan. Now for canceled loans, we have to be really specific with that because those funds are sitting there and available to the applicant, right, unless we have some paperwork that shows that they're not. So they need to obtain, you know, in the best world, you would want to obtain written communication from the lender that the loan has been canceled. We have talked to SBA about that, and that's not necessarily something they do as a regular practice, but the grantee could certainly reach out to SBA, their contacts there, to try to get that in writing. Or, and maybe this is easier from an administrative standpoint, you establish a legally binding agreement between you and the applicant, right, which you have to do anyway. But in that agreement, you're going to make sure that the applicant states that they will not draw down those loan proceeds that have been undispersed, that are sitting in a bank, that are sitting in an account somewhere with the SBA. They have to agree not to draw those additional funds down, and you need a legally binding agreement to do that. All right, so let's talk about the new law, right? So that's why we're all here and focusing on this so much. So the law, the DRRA, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, basically set a loan, including a subsidized loan, is not a prohibited duplication of benefits, with a pretty big caveat, provided that all federal assistance is used towards a loss suffered as a result of a major disaster. So the caveat's really important here. A loan is not duplicative if all federal assistance was used towards a loss. So, and it also applies to 2016 and beyond. So it didn't include our 2015 disaster folks. So just our 2016 and on to 2021 disaster, so it also sunsets. And then when we're talking about subsidized loans, we also want to break that up a little bit, right? Because potentially the entire loan has been dispersed. Maybe they have spent 100% of that money, or maybe they haven't. Maybe they've spent about half of it, like I mentioned on the canceled loan. They still have some money they haven't drawn down yet. So we want to make sure we're differentiating between dispersed and undispersed. So we're going to break that up a little bit more. So on the undispersed portion, so remember in this case, this is actually very similar to the canceled loan provision in the 2019 notice that applies to 2015 grantees as well. The only difference here that applies to the 2016 and on class is this third bullet, right? So the third bullet that says for undispersed loan amounts, the applicant has to have an agreement not to draw down funds without approval. So in this case, an applicant could potentially draw down additional funds, A, if the grantee allows them to do that, and B, if the grantee is willing to monitor that to make sure that all the funds drawn down from a loan that is undispersed at this point is used for a disaster-related loss, right? So there's just a lot of monitoring that would fall on the grantee if they chose to allow their applicants to have access to those funds later. And so it's just something you kind of want to think about. If it's a canceled loan on the previous provision that we talked about, that loan is canceled, it's done, you've all agreed in writing, no one's going to draw down funds. But on the undispersed loan amount under DRRA, so only for 2016, 17, 18, and 19 grantees, as of right now, that's all we have. Those grantees, the undispersed loan amount is not a DOB. You do need to notify the lender. And again, everyone needs to be on the same page that the applicant is either not going to draw down the funds, or if they're going to, they have to have approval from the grantee to do it. So what about dispersed loan amounts? So the loan amounts that they've given, they've already drawn down before they've come to you for DR assistance. Again, the law says it's not a DOB. As long as you can verify that that assistance was used towards a loss from the disaster, that's at least key, and we always have to think about what documentation we're going to use to verify that. But the really difference here is that these amounts are now available to be reimbursed if the grantee chooses to do that. So the 2019 DOB notice allows grantees to reimburse the costs paid by SBA loans. There's a lot of guardrails around it. There's a lot of requirements if you decide to do this as part of your program. So I want to just encourage you to really reach out to your CBD grant manager, your CBD rep, work with them on this if this is something that you're interested in doing. We can certainly provide TA on it to kind of go over those guardrails in the notice. But that's really what the dispersed loan amount under DRRA allows folks to do. That's different and very new for us. All right, so let's talk a little bit about process and making sure we're all on the same page about how we're representing these changes. We'll start at the beginning. This is the basics, right? So everyone, this is the same before the 2019 notice. You're going to conduct individual DOB analysis, right? We can't do any sort of blanket DOB analysis. This is all at an individual applicant level. You're going to verify all sources of assistance prior to the awarding of the funds. You're going to determine the remaining funding need for DR assistance before you have committed funds or awarded assistance. So you're going to do the math, right? And Carrie has some great examples, some really complicated examples, complex examples that she's going to walk through that I think are really going to help some light bulbs go off on this process. But that's really important. You always want to do the math and make sure you understand it, make sure the HUD rep can come in and follow, and they're monitoring the math, right? So what are exceptions, what are exclusions, you know, what was your final determination on award amount? And then, of course, for all our funds, that's a part of this process, you have to have the applicant sign a subrogation agreement. So you're also required to use the best, most recent available data from FEMA, SBA, and insurers, and any other sources, state and federal sources of funding, to make sure that you're preventing any DOBs prior to the awarding of assistance. And then we've bolded the second bullet. This is a big one. Remember that as part of your DOB analysis, and you'll see it in the 2019 DOB notice, it's really a secondary step. After you've done your math and you've excluded and you've accepted and you have your final, or what you believe to be a final award amount, you need to do your necessary and reasonable test, right? So you've got to walk through that analysis and think about, and you know, Michaela went through this about the prudent person test. You have to have some things set up in your program to make sure that you're doing that analysis as part of this whole DOB process. So don't forget about that. And that's another thing that Carrie will bring up in her examples that I think will really show you guys how that comes into play. And then also make sure your policies and procedures now reflect all these new, this new treatment of loans. It's consistent with the requirements of the decline loan provision and the DRRA. And so obviously this is easier, this is much easier for 2018 and 19 disaster class folks coming in and just reading that notice for the first time. This is a lot harder for our 2015 disasters, our 2016 and 17 disasters, who are really, you know, in some cases mid-program when this law was passed. And so we kind of just want to walk through the steps for you guys specifically to make sure, again, we're on the same page when it comes to process. So this is directly from our DOB implementation notice that Michaela introduced at the beginning. It's really for those folks mid-program. So the implementation notice says that, and this is a quote, we just took it right from there, so there's no misinterpretation here. Grantees that revise their duplication of benefits, policies, and procedures to conform to the requirements of this notice and the 2019 DOB notice must resubmit their policies and procedures to HUD for review. The grantee must amend or update policies and procedures that HUD determines are inadequate. So what does that mean? Let's talk about steps. So the June 2019 implementation notice came out. That has an applicability date of June 25th. So you'll hear us talk about June 25th a lot, and that's just because when we publish a Federal Register notice, it's usually not applicable until about 5 days later. So you can always find, when you go to Federal Register notice at the top, find that applicability date. It's always important. In this case, it's June 25th, 2019. So the steps that really grantees should have taken, and we're focusing on 2015 here since only part of the laws apply to them, part of the notice applies to them. After that notice was published, a grantee should have reviewed their current action plan and policies and procedures to make sure they comply with the decline loans provision. And I think 99% of the cases that's going to be right, that your current policies are already not counting decline loans as a DOB. We never required you to count them as a DOB. We had some guidance about it from 2013 that talked about a necessary and reasonable test on that, but decline loans were never DOB. So we should just make sure that you're not counting them, you haven't been counting them, so that's just a check on your program. Step 2 would be on the canceled loan provision, the way it's written in the 2019 notice. Now this is really a decision point for the grantee, and whether or not the grantee wants to go backwards and look at some of the programs and activities that were in its action plan before, maybe some past DOB analysis that you've done on applicants, and see if there were canceled loans that were treated as DOBs. You can make a decision to go back and redo that and start not counting canceled loan as a DOB, as long as you're meeting all the requirements we talked about, getting that proper documentation, which is super important. So it's really up to you as a grantee whether or not you want to go back and do that. What should be really clear to both the public and the HUD staff who are coming to monitor is what decision you made and when you made it. So that should be written down somewhere. It should be in your policies and procedures. It shouldn't be a question about what decision you made about going backwards. And then for the last step, obviously any program or activity in your action plan that is new, so it's added after June 25th, 2019, the new rules would apply. So you'd want to make sure everything that we've mentioned on canceled loans, since we're talking about 2015 disasters, are a part of your new policies and procedures for any of these new activities added after the applicability date of that notice. So 2016 and 17 grantees, you're really going to follow the same steps if you're talking about decline loans or canceled loans. So those steps are the same for you, but you just have some additional choices, some additional decision points to make when it comes to the treatment of subsidized loans under DRRA, whether dispersed or undispersed. And it's the same kind of decision point, whether or not you want to go backwards and look at were there applicants that had undispersed loans that were counted as a DOB. Were there, is reimbursement something you want to pursue under the dispersed option? So again, it needs to be transparent. It should be very clear what decision you made and when you made it. to either go back and redo some of your DOB analysis for these new laws that were passed, or you chose not to, and that's okay too. It is a choice. And then with step 4, again, any new program activity in your action plan after June 25th, 2019, on or after, should be following those new policies and procedures. And then, as I mentioned earlier, again, it is a little bit easier for our newest class of grantees that for 2018 and 19 DR grantees, you're just following the DOB notice. With mitigation, things can get a little complicated based on the disaster year, but remember that this is for any programs or activities in an action plan after June 25th, 2019. So even for your mitigation funds, that's going to be probably all of your mitigation activities and programs would follow the new DOB notice, just based on timing. All right, we are going to move it over to Carrie to walk through some great examples that I think will really help everyone put this stuff to practice. Carrie?
Hey, everybody. I have to say, we put complex examples as a label here, but I don't know that anybody asks easy questions about DOB. So in some ways, they're all complex, right? But we did try to pull some examples here for you all that represent some of the recent questions we've gotten since the publication of the June 2019 DOB notice. And so hopefully these will help frame things up for you, and then I'm sure they'll just spur a bunch more questions, but we'll take that step by step. So first, just the DOB analysis in short. It's a little bit different in the 2019 notice than it is in the 2011 notice, and Jen covered some of that. But the steps are basically, you're going to start with determining needs. That's always the place you start. And then you're looking at total assistance available to the applicant. And this can be modified by the treatment of loans. As Jen mentioned, if the DRRA exception applies, or if the declined or canceled loan provision is in play, and you're treating loans a little bit differently, they're no longer included in total assistance. So number 2 can vary depending on your treatment of loans. Number 3, excluding non-duplicative amounts from the DOB analysis. These are just the 2 categories that Jen laid out. Funds for a general purpose that were not used for the same purpose, funds for a different purpose, or funds for the same purpose but a different eligible use. So when you calculate the duplication of benefits, you're just doing a little bit of math. You're taking your total assistance and you're subtracting all the things you've excluded as non-duplicative. And that gives you what everybody identifies as the duplicative amount, the DOB. And then you're going to calculate the maximum award you can give. It's the total need, which you started with, minus the duplication of benefits amount, which you've just calculated in step 4. Some of our grantees impose program caps. That's kind of the next step to getting your final award. And just as a reminder, you can reassess unmet need when you need to throughout throughout the assistance determination, or even down the road if someone comes back and says, look, my construction site was vandalized and I can't complete my project, can you provide additional assistance? As long as it's okay under your program caps and there's not a duplication of benefits, you can reassess unmet need as you need to. And the notice talks a little bit about that. So let's start with an example. And this one just tries to help give a little bit of framework about what do you do with windfalls, and how does the necessary and reasonable analysis that every grantee has to do for every cost under Part 200 line up with the duplication of benefits analysis that everyone has to do under the Stafford Act. So in this example, we're talking about Cautious County, and they had a flood disaster, in 2016. And we know from Jen's summary that 2016 is a disaster that qualified for DRRA treatment of loans in the duplication of benefits analysis. So in this example, Cautious County is going to do a buyout program, and they're going to buy out some properties next to the river to reduce their flood risk. And they're going to use pre-disaster value for buyouts. And if you remember from the notices, grantees have to choose. We give grantees a little bit of flexibility. If they're reducing risk by acquiring land that's at risk through buyouts, they can pay for the pre-disaster value, even though the post-disaster value of the property is likely substantially reduced because of damage. Carl lives in the target buyout area for Cautious County. He got a $20,000 grant from FEMA Individual Assistance Program to rehabilitate his house. And he also accepted, meaning he signed, a $60,000 SBA loan for rehabilitation. And in this case, he has expended all of his SBA, all $60,000, and $10,000 of the amount that he got from FEMA at the time he received the buyout offer. So he's still got $10,000 left over his FEMA funds. His pre-storm value was $140,000, and his current fair market value is $70,000. So how are the rehab funds treated in the buyout DOB analysis? So we set it up looking at the same framework that we talked about just now with our summary. So the total need here for a buyout is the amount that you're going to pay for purchasing the home. It's $140,000, and I'm starring this because it's a preliminary amount. We know we have to go through several steps in the analysis here. So let's just put down, since we give everybody pre-storm value, $140,000. Then we're going to look at the total assistance Carl received. So in this case, it's a 2016 disaster, and we're assuming for purposes of this example that this grantee, Cautious County, has modified its DOB procedures to follow the DRRA flexibilities. So in this case, he did get $60,000 in SBA loans, but they're no longer a duplication because the grantee has confirmed that Carl spent $60,000 for his rehabilitation. So his total assistance, since the loan is no longer assistance because the grantee confirmed that all funds were expended for a disaster loss, is only $20,000. In this case, the $20,000 was provided for rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is not the same purpose as a buyout. A buyout is acquisition to reduce risk. And so in this case, the $20,000 is actually excluded. So when you look at the duplication of benefits amount, it's zero. And remember we came back and we said, this $140,000 is preliminary. So what's missing from this analysis? Something doesn't feel right because we know Carl has $10,000 sitting in his pocket. He did not expend his FEMA money. So when we're looking at this example, we know all grantees, as Michaela and Jen just talked about, have to comply with necessary and reasonable cost principles. This is a requirement of all CDBG-DR grants, and it applies to every single expenditure. So the costs have to be necessary and reasonable for the performance of the award. And the reasonableness test is really a prudent person test, right? What would you do if you were a prudent person trying to decide how to expend non-federal dollars? If Cautious County was going to use Cautious County's own funding, how would it make a decision in this case? And so when you look at the requirements, they're all found in, the cost principles are all found in 2 CFR Part 200. And there are regulations there that discuss the factors affecting the allowability of costs. So costs have to meet general criteria. They have to be necessary and reasonable, and then they have to be just eligible for the grant. Reasonable costs, they have to be reasonable if in their nature and amount they're not exceeding what would be incurred by a prudent person, And you're really looking at the totality of the circumstances there, and Part 200 includes several factors that are going to weigh into that analysis. And then also the costs have to be allocable to the federal award. And the cost principles say that costs are allocable to a federal award if they can't be charged to any other federal award, or they're, they really are just chargeable and assignable only to that federal award and the final cost objective. So in this case, Carl has this $10,000 in his pocket that FEMA provided for rehab. The rehab isn't going to go forward. There's no point in spending that $10,000 for rehab because Cautious County is going to buy the house and demolish it. What are the options for Cautious County? So we would advise that when you're doing your analysis of what is necessary and reasonable, Carl shouldn't keep a windfall in his pocket. He should either return $10,000 to FEMA or reduce the amount of Carl's buyout by $10,000 because he's got that cash in his pocket. And so when you say that, when you say, oh, well, reduce Carl's buyout amount by $10,000, what about the requirement that all buyout participants have to either be given pre-disaster or post-disaster value, meaning you have to treat all of your buyout participants the same way? Well, at the end of the day, that's a starting point, right? And we didn't start with the post-disaster value in Carl's case. We started, we did not start with the post-disaster value. We started with pre-disaster value, which was $140,000. If you had a duplication of benefits or you had a, in other words, there were some other funds being provided for the buyout, or there was insurance, which is treated as a duplication for purposes of buyouts, then you're going to reduce that amount. You can also reduce the amount if it's not necessary and reasonable for the acquisition. So in this case, just assuming that, we know that initial total need needs to be the same, and the analysis isn't going to change. You still have $20,000 in total assistance, $20,000 in FEMA funds. In this case, when you calculate the maximum award, you need to finish the analysis by applying necessary and reasonable cost principles. And in this case, if Carl does not return the cash to FEMA, the $10,000, you should reduce his award by $10,000, the amount of cash in his pocket, just to make sure that your expenditures are necessary and reasonable. So let's change up the example a little bit. What if Carl spent all the FEMA funds, the $20,000, but not all of the SBA funds, the $60,000? How would we revise the analysis? Well, of course, the pre-storm value is going to be the same, but in this case, the SBA funds haven't been dispersed. They can be canceled and subtracted from total assistance. So Jen talked a little bit about canceled loans. SBA disperses its loans in increments. The first $25,000 to $35,000, depending on the SBA rules, just goes out the door automatically in most cases. But after that, FEMA requires draws that are kind of like any construction loan. They want you to draw as you have need. So chances are, if Carl hasn't done the work, he hasn't drawn down the full amount of the SBA loan. That means that those funds are undispersed, and under the DRRA, they could be treated as undispersed loan funds, or they could be canceled if you're after the period that the loan funds were available. And either way, they're just no longer part of total assistance. So this, of course, requires that you are following the requirements of the 2019 DOB notice, meaning you have entered an agreement with Carl that he's not going to draw those loan funds any longer. And if required, you're informing SBA about this, this cancellation. And then you still have the $20,000 in FEMA funds, and you still have, but in this case, you've expended all of those $20,000. So they were expended for a different purpose, and that purpose was rehabilitation. So it's a different purpose. It's not duplicative. So the total duplication of benefits amount is 0. And Carl did not draw those SBA funds that he didn't use, so there's no necessary and reasonable problem. And so the amount that you can provide is $140,000. You can provide the full buyout amount in this case. There's no windfall to Carl because those SBA loan funds are not available to him any longer if you follow the requirements of the 2019 DOB notice. So let's change it up again. What if you were doing your necessary and reasonable analysis and reducing the price would cause the price to dip below fair market value? Well, you know, we've said for a long time, you know, fair market value is the amount that anyone would buy that home for on the street. It's not really assistance. You know, it's more of an arm's length transaction. And so you still have to have a necessary and reasonable analysis. But if you're assuming, for example, here, that Carl got $30,000 in assistance that's unexpended from FEMA, and he has a fair market value of $115,000. He still has this pre-storm value of $140,000. And this is, you know, again, it's this preliminary amount that you're starting with. His total assistance includes the FEMA, $30,000. It doesn't include the SBA for the reasons that we just discussed above. So these $30,000 in FEMA funds were funds for a different purpose. So, but they weren't really expended, and they're just sitting in his hand. So there's no duplication because the funds were for a different purpose. But we've got a necessary and reasonable problem because there's $30,000 in Carl's pocket. So this $140,000 is subject to the necessary and reasonable analysis. And if you just reduced the purchase price by $30,000, the price would reduce to $110,000, and that is below fair market value. So do you have to pay Carl less than fair market value? And, you know, really at the end of the day, you know, this is a tough one, and it's the reason that we chose it for this example. Necessary and reasonable analysis does not have a bright line, the way that duplication of benefits is just a math problem, and the lines are much clearer. When you're talking about what's reasonable here, you know, you can probably make the case that it's reasonable to pay Carl fair market value for his property, $115,000. Then he's still going to have $5,000 of cash in his pocket. So, you know, you can take the risk and say, you know, I'm just going to give him the 115, and he got a small windfall there, but it's, you know, it's not a big deal. Or, you know, that is a risk and probably not recommended. The best case scenario would be to just take some extra precautions to demonstrate reasonability. For example, you could send Carl a letter saying, hey, Carl, repay that money. Or you could send a letter to FEMA to say, hey, FEMA, we're buying out Carl's home. He's got $5,000 there. And you could come up with probably some other things that would help you justify the award as reasonable. But at the end of the day, there's no bright line. You need to look at the full list of factors in Part 200 and then decide how you're going to justify as a grantee that your assistance to Carl is reasonable. Let's switch it up and go to a different example. Now we're talking about the state of bad luck. And once again, we're talking about flood disasters. State of bad luck got hit by two disasters, once in 2015 and then again in 2017. Sally lives in the state of bad luck, and she owns a home that was affected by both floods. In 2017, she applied to FEMA. She got $20,000 to rehab her home. But before that 2017 flood, she hadn't really completed her rehabilitation. Most of her rehab work that was started was completely damaged by the second flood. And we can just say all of it was damaged by the second flood. And so in 2017, FEMA gave Sally an additional $20,000. This is for the second disaster. So Sally hasn't completed any rehab since the 2017 flood, and now it's 2018, and she's applying to the state of bad luck for CDBG-DR assistance. and it's going to cost $100,000 to rehab the home. Here the need is $100,000. Total assistance here includes both the FEMA 2015 funds and the FEMA 2017 funds, so $40,000. And our challenge is to really think about what are we excluding, how do we identify a DOB, and how do we calculate an award here? So how should the state treat the FEMA funds? In this case, we really have a lot of consideration. We gave some flexibility in the 2019 DOB notice dealing with multiple disasters, and we consulted with FEMA for a long time about this because it's a challenge that exists more and more, unfortunately. And there are many, many examples, California, Louisiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, that in recent years have had multiple disasters. So here, just ask yourself a series of questions when you're planning for these types of scenarios. Can Sally document how she spent her 2015 FEMA funds? If so, great, you're in the best shape. You can use her actual costs to determine whether you can exclude those funds for funds that were used for their eligible purpose. If Sally doesn't have documentation, then the next question under that new flexibility in the DOB notice from 2019 is how long does Sally have to retain records under her FEMA award from 2015? If the period that FEMA required Sally to maintain documentation is passed, as long as the grantee provides all kinds of warnings that are pretty clearly spelled out in the DOB notice about what it means to defraud the federal government or defraud the state, and how much she expended, she can give a signed self-certification to the grantee, and the grantee can use that for their DOB documentation. You always, always, always have to ask when there are two disasters, if Sally got assistance from the first disaster, was that assistance conditioned on obtaining and maintaining flood insurance? If it was, and Sally did not obtain and maintain flood insurance, she is not eligible for certain types of flood disaster assistance after the second flood disaster. And she may not be able to get rehab assistance at all. But for purposes of our example, let's assume that Sally did get the signed self-certification, and she in this case, there's no evidence of fraud, and Sally was covered by FEMA's group flood insurance policy. If FEMA's documentation retention period is passed, then that self-certification is great. The total need is $100,000. The total assistance is $40,000. That $15,000, which Sally is documented with a self-certification, that is non-duplicative because it was used for an eligible purpose. And the total need then, the total DOB, which is $40,000 minus $15,000, is $25,000. And the maximum award, which is the total need, $100,000, minus the total DOB, $25,000, is $75,000. Now let's switch it up again. What if FEMA's documentation period has not passed? What if the two storms happen year one and year two, and FEMA has a 2-year documentation period? Well, in this case, Sally can't just sign a self-certification, but the grantee has some other options. I mean, there are always options available to try to recreate through an inspection and a corroboration with flood levels, the grantee's reasonable estimate of the work that was done immediately before, in this case, the second disaster that happened. Let's say the grantee does that and they value that work at $20,000. They have some documentation for funds that were expended for an eligible purpose. They've confirmed Sally was covered by a group flood insurance policy. Now they're in good shape. They can do their DOB analysis. $100,000 in need, $40,000 in total assistance, and $20,000 that they can exclude because they've done their inspection and they've corroborated with flood levels, and they can document that in the file. Those funds were expended for an eligible purpose, even though they would otherwise be duplicative. So the duplication of benefits, or the remaining 2017 FEMA funds of $20,000 that haven't been expended for rehab, and the maximum award is $80,000. The big key to remember here is that you cannot say, oh, 2015 and 2017 were different disasters, therefore it's a different purpose and I can exclude one disaster's assistance from another disaster's duplication of benefits. If the total need is a combined need remaining after both disasters, you have to account for the assistance received to respond to that need. And that is pretty clearly discussed in our duplication of benefits notice. So what if the state has no evidence that Sally used the FEMA funds? And here's where, you know, we end up with heartbreaking scenarios over and over. I mean, facing a duplication, especially when you're talking about a low and moderate income beneficiary, is just a challenge. So what do? You know, you've got $100,000 in rehab, you've got $40,000 in FEMA rehab assistance for the same purpose. Any funds not expended for the rehab are a DOB. So what are you going to do? First, you look to see, does Sally have cash on hand? Can you delay your closing to allow her to get that cash to bring to the closing? Can she dip into her savings? Can she bring some other source to cover the cost of that DOB? Great. Another way to look at this is to reduce the scope of a need. You always start out by providing the need, the total need, that you would give anyone applying to the program. But if for some reason you need to adjust the scope that you're going to provide to reduce the amount of assistance, you can reduce the amount of assistance if you can still get a certificate of occupancy. And that's really a useful tool, actually, to cover smaller amounts of duplication benefits. It might not get you to $40,000. You would be hard-pressed to come up with $40,000 in scope reduction in a $100,000 project and still get a certificate of occupancy. You can also consider what funds are, you know, for the same purpose. So you can look to see whether FEMA can revise its award to shift some of that assistance to allow it to be spent for other needs assistance. That's pretty rare and it's really time intensive, so it's tough to make that part of your everyday policy, but it might work on some rare occasions. You can also look at the FEMA award itself to see whether FEMA allowed some other eligible use of the funds, such as interim housing, and whether Sally can show that she used some of those FEMA funds for that purpose that was also FEMA eligible. If that's the case, you can exclude. And then ultimately, you can look at whether buyout is an option for Sally. And if yes, you just remember, consider necessary and reasonable implications and figure out how you're going to treat Sally's situation, because you know she's had some cash that she expended for other purposes. And it may be, as long as she doesn't have it on hand, that you have you can do some consideration of whether she expended it for other purposes, but you need to think through a strategy for how you're going to deal with that if you're going to go with the buyout option. And then we're going to go through these business examples pretty quickly because we have a few more slides and then we want to leave time for questions. So this is just, and we wanted to throw in a business assistance example for a couple of reasons. One, there are a lot of businesses that are struggling right now. They're post-disaster and they're dealing with COVID, and you know, you really just have to think through, you know, how you're going to meet your economic revitalization needs. So business assistance is in the front and center and a hot topic right now. So let's say, you know, Sally Shoemaker has a shoe repair shop. She's a for-profit, and she's eligible for assistance as a special economic development project. She had some damage to her business, but because of the continued depressed post-disaster economy, she is also having to consider whether to lay off some of her employees. So there's a real potential that she has a national objective need here to just retain some jobs. And so she had a $30,000 grant from a local economic development authority. And the first question is, you know, can a grantee assist Sally without causing a DOB? Well, economic development assistance, you have a lot of flexibility in terms of the type of things that you're funding with that economic development assistance. So you can just either fund one of the eligible uses that the Economic Development Authority didn't fund, or you can make sure that, and when you do, you still have to do a duplication of benefits analysis to make sure that Sally has need for that other purpose and she doesn't have a financial assistance to cover that other purpose. But you know, you can look to see, for example, let's say Economic Development Authority funded working capital needs. So current assets minus current liabilities, and then you're left with, you know, a difference, and that difference is, you know, how you calculate the amount of assistance you're going to provide to cover your, you know, day-to-day expenses over a 12-month period, like payroll, health insurance, mortgage, rent, utilities, all of these things. So if you are in a situation where that's what the Economic Development Authority provided, you can provide assistance for a different purpose. Those different purposes might be refinancing high-interest loans, upgrading the HVAC system, or adding solar just so you can reduce the electric bill for Sally. And you can be really strategic in your business assistance so that you can reduce long-term and short-term costs for that business. You know, those options are available to you. But you really need to think about, you know, how you're going to provide assistance without causing a duplication of benefits. And so we've got a few tips for you. One, you know, if you were going to provide assistance that is a short-term subsidized loan upfront because you know additional assistance is coming later, let's say you're trying to get out in front of the economic development loan and just provide some bridge loan assistance until that can get here, there is an exception in the DOB notice for short loans. And when that exception applies, you're taken out of the, you know, assistance category. So if you were going to do that, you need to make sure that your loan documents are drafted to make sure that they are clearly short-term. Otherwise, it's hard to fall into that assistance. And you can do that in the recitals, but also the loan document terms themselves. If you were going to make a forgivable loan, which is an eligible use of funds, you have to make sure that it isn't a grant in disguise. It really, to fall within the exception, has to have some loan terms that are enforceable if conditions are not met, i.e., if they don't meet those conditions, the loan is not forgivable. And then finally, you have to do economic development underwriting anytime you're providing special economic development assistance. And this is something that Congress required, actually, as a requirement of all CDBG-DR special economic development assistance under the annual program and under the CDBG-DR program in recent years, going back to 2017. And if you look at underwriting for economic development assistance, the CDBG regs actually set out the underwriting standards that apply, and they really help you set up, you know, an identification of need when you're calculating duplication of benefits. What is your need? What is your total need that you're starting with? And, you know, when you look at these underwriting standards are in Appendix A to 24 CFR Part 570. That's the CFR Code of Federal Regulations that includes all of the CDBG regulations. And I think the key to all of this, you know, the Appendix A talks through how you set up your underwriting guidelines and what you need to consider. But the key to determining the total need for your support is really how much CDBG funds you can provide without substituting CDBG funds for non-federal financial support. So you have to review the entire economic development project to make sure that, to the extent practicable, CDBG funds are not going to substantially reduce the amount of non-federal financial support for the activity that you're funding. And this really maximizes your CDBG funds for economic development, but it also uses CDBG to fill gaps as opposed to just, you know, maximizing profit at exorbitant amounts. So we're going to turn it back over to Michaela. in just a second here, but I wanted to address a couple of questions that came up earlier in the presentation. So the first one, let's talk about the sunset in 2023. How would your DOB analysis change if, let's say, you're talking about a disaster that happens in 2021, the last year that is a DRRA qualifying disaster, but your DOB analysis is happening in 2023. And I just want to point out that there is an absolute sunset of the entire DRRA amendment to the Stafford Act that happens in 2023. So if you are on the cusp, if you're going to get out assistance for a 2021 disaster, but you're getting it out the door in 2023, or for any disaster really, any of the qualifying disasters, it needs to go out the door before October 5th, 2023, because after that, it's like Cinderella's outfit after the ball. It's after midnight and it disappears. Another question we had was how to treat in-kind in-kind donations from a nonprofit. Can you fill a DOB gap by in-kind assistance? And at the end of the day, it goes back to this question of need. If you have in-kind assistance up front and you know that in-kind assistance is going to, provide materials for a construction project, then if you know that at the outset, you really have to reduce your need because that is covered. In-kind assistance is not financial assistance. It's not going to cause a DOB, but if you're coordinating with a nonprofit to provide exactly certain materials, then you need to be fair in how you're analyzing your need. You can't include a need that's being met by these materials. So our advice is just to let nonprofits fill the gap after. If you have reduced scope, for example, and you didn't provide air conditioning so that you could save $17,000 in a rehab project to cover a DOB, if a nonprofit came in afterwards and you didn't coordinate it and it wasn't part of your analysis and your decision and they provided an air conditioner, that is not a duplication of benefits because it's not in-kind assistance, it's not financial assistance. But you have to be honest about including things that you're aware of in your needs analysis when you're coming up with your scope for your total need for the rehab project at the outset. Another question we have is how would DOB look for a new construction? And I think, for new construction projects, it's going to look really similar to business assistance, right? I mean, you're really going to look at sources and uses, and you're going to look at, what gaps there are in your total sources available, and that you're going to come up with your total need by really looking at what financial assistance is needed to make that construction project go forward. So DOB definitely applies to new construction the same way it applies to all uses of funds. And then lastly, I think the only other question was really about the pandemic, and the need is ongoing as the pandemic and restrictions continue. We might have unmet needs that are changing. And just remember, if you have a disaster and then you've got 6 months of shutdown due to the pandemic, it's really going to aggravate things. You can always go back in and reassess unmet need at a later time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michaela.
Thank you, Carrie. So Carrie and Jen and I so far have really been talking about, what is a DOB and what is not a DOB, and how does this relate to your DOB analysis. So now let's kind of talk about the last part of DOB, which has to do with recapture. And, hopefully you won't have to do any recapture if you have a good understanding of your DOB analysis and, you're keeping track of it and there aren't any glitches down the road. But what happens if recapture does occur? So first, you should have policies and procedures in place. And the 2019 DOB notice talks about this too, and requires you to have your recapture policies of how you will enforce recapture. And typically this is done in the form of a subrogation agreement or something similar. And that is your agreement that will be between the grantee or another administering agency and its beneficiary. And you'll want to make sure that these are signed before the CDBG-DR assistance is awarded and out the door. But your recapture policies and procedures are also going to want to discuss risk. And the risk is really about the potential of DOB occurring, whether it's in the future or now, and how that's going to come into play. And it might not be something that you're currently thinking about, but it should be. And you should have this in mind to help you with what could create a DOB in the future with your CDBG-DR activities that you guys are partaking, and how to inform your monitoring plan for DOB after you've made these awards. So for example, if you're a grantee that is using your subrecipients to administer a program, you are going to want to use this risk piece to help you establish a methodology for monitoring to make sure that all of your DOB requirements are being met. And with that, we're just going to hit on some of the common best practices and recommendations for DOB and how to avoid them and avoid recapture when possible. And so a lot of this kind of goes along with our presentation as a whole, but you really want to think about what's already out there and what's available. So who has existing disaster recovery programs and what types of assistance are they offering? And then that might determine how you design your recovery programs. So you could design your programs to address those eligible needs that are not currently being addressed, or maybe there are programs out there, but they're not fully fundable, and so there may be a gap that CDBG-DR funds need to fill for those types of activities. And that will help limit your risk from occurring in the first place when you initially are making your CDBG-DR awards. Another practical step that you probably want to consider and keep in mind is how you're going to relay this information to the public on DOB, and explaining what you are or aren't funding for certain activities, and then communicating to your constituents who other providers are and where they can find those resources. And so this communication and education is really going to be helpful to help your constituents find resources to meet their needs. And another practice that you guys can do is you can stagger your applications for your activity periods. Continuing some of those best practice items is you're going to want to establish your data sharing agreements, and you're going to want to establish them early. So many of you probably already have these in place, but especially for our newer grantees and our new class, those of you that are still in those planning stages, you want to make sure that you have agreements with our federal partners like SBA and FEMA and other relevant entities to help you guys verify what assistance is available and out there when you guys are doing your individual DOB analysis. And then we kind of already mentioned subrogation agreements, but here you really want to make sure that your agreements are enforceable in case recapture occurs. And then another item you're going to want to be thinking about is technical assistance. So that can be to your subrecipients or contractors or anyone that may be involved in your DOB process and running those programs. So you can really communicate with them and have them help you identify what types of training do they need to help them understand DOB so that they're able to do it and do it correctly. So what if a DOB happens and you found a DOB? You're going to want to take those necessary steps that we've kind of been talking about here, and you might need to reevaluate the need if it's possible, Go through your documentation and your files and check for accuracy. And then at that point, if there is still a DOB without any of the need being reevaluated and reassessed, you will probably need to, at that point, notify the beneficiary and explain to them what repayment is and explain to them why it's happening at that stage. And then lastly, you would turn to your debt collection processes to collect the amount of duplicative CDBG-DR assistance. So monitoring. Many of you guys know that our Chapter 6 exhibits are undergoing revisions, so just stay tuned for those specific updates. But generally, HUD is going to want to see a walkthrough of how you are conducting your DOB analysis. So HUD will review your DOB policies and procedures and might look to your data sharing agreements with those applicable agencies and really just reviewing your activity files and the documentation that you're collecting. So that might include a specific DOB analysis walkthrough, what the unmet need was, how it was determined, what sources of assistance were provided, and how are you meeting those requirements in the 2019 DOB notice, similar to the treatment of loans and exclusions and exceptions that we talked about, and verifying that you have a subrogation or similar type of agreement in place. And then again, just some of those key messages is to communicate to your constituents early. Explain what a DOB is and why it's important for them to understand. And that's really helpful for you guys and for your beneficiaries to eliminate surprises on the front end where you can, and help make everyone's lives a little bit easier, just to understand the process, because it can be very complex and overwhelming. You also want to explain the importance of spending the disaster recovery funds that your constituents are receiving for the purpose of their award. And so this is something you might want to take on as soon as you find out that you're getting CDBG-DR funds in the very beginning of this process. So educate your public about using their funds for the purposes that they're awarded for. And this education can really help prove to be valuable as you're designing and implementing your recovery program. And then we kind of talked about this earlier too, is you really want to be assessing your risk and potential risk for duplication of benefits occurring. And so here on this slide, we have some resources. These are previous webinars that we've done on DOB, the links to our Federal Register notices covering DOB, and then some other guidance that you guys can view. We now have about 10 minutes left for questions. And two, if you guys have questions that don't get answered during this 10-minute period, grantees, you guys can always contact your CPD representative. And then there's also the HUD policy unit email that's showing on the screen. So you guys can always email us your questions too. And so first, to kind of kick off the questions, we've gotten a lot of questions about, do new construction activities, do infrastructure activities, do they all require DOB analysis? So do we want to just kind of start, Jen and Carrie, by kicking it off with a simple infrastructure example on how DOB would kind of come into play here?
So this is Jen. I can take this one, and then Carrie, it'll give you some time maybe to look through to see what other questions we want to tackle. We have a ton of questions. Great. You guys we appreciate how many questions you guys are sending in. But just to focus on the infrastructure example, I would say, again, it's like anything else, you still have a DOB analysis. In the case of, infrastructure that's publicly owned, you also are going to have this additional calculation of local funds that are available for that activity. If you're a state giving funds to a local government subrecipient to do infrastructure, what the analysis would need to include is any local funds that may have been previously earmarked for that kind of project, or maybe a project that they sort of had on their bucket list to fund, had funds geared towards that project, and then now they have this DR money and they think, oh, well, we'll just use the DR money. So we can't supplant local funds, right? So that's just an additional step I would mention on the infrastructure projects you want to consider, but it's a little more straightforward in that you as the grantee who are carrying out these projects should be able to do the DOB analysis on what funds are available for that purpose and what funds have been received to date.
Thanks, Jen. For our next question, it's about buyout programs and the current fair market value. So I'll read the question first, and then Carrie, if you want to take this one. So the question is, for a buyout program that uses the current fair market value as the purchase price, if an incentive is provided after the property is purchased to ensure that the new home is affordable, such as down payment assistance, is the current market value a DOB with this incentive?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. It's popped up a couple of times today. So, for a buyout program, a lot of the grantees come up with combined buyouts with a little bit of assistance to find the next source of housing. So, in the example, this is an incentive to sell the property. And then there are other situations where you might have new down payment assistance or some kind of soft second assistance for purchasing a home. And in those cases, the easiest way to think about the analysis is to break it down into two mini duplication of benefits analyses, because a buyout is actually a different purpose from an incentive, a housing incentive. A buyout is a separate purpose from down payment assistance, but you can combine it as long as you're looking at the total assistance received from all sources for both purposes, and as long as you're looking at the total need for both purposes combined. It's okay to combine them and just do one math problem, but you really need to be clear about identifying, okay, this is, this is how I'm doing duplication of benefits for down payment assistance. And the importance for that is that you don't necessarily have to reduce your down payment assistance because you might have a duplication of benefit on the buyout side and vice versa. And so you really need to think through what purposes you are meeting with the assistance that you're providing. And if you can think of them as separate awards, even though you're doing the analysis all together, I think that's helpful. It might also be that you can, if you have a DOB with one, if you have questions about whether you can offset one purpose's DOB with another, I don't think I've been asked that question before, so follow up with us if that comes up in your specific case and just ask separately, because I don't want to speak before I'm looking at actual facts for something like that. We also had another question that's related about scope reduction. And so the question about scope reduction is, how is scope reduction a theory for addressing duplication of benefits? How does it work? And the basic premise is you are providing assistance that is the same type of assistance. Everyone in your program that comes into your program is eligible for the same basic assistance. And for your program, that might mean, corian counters and side-by-side fridge and, air conditioning and elevation, just the basics, right? And it's, that you can, that's the amount of assistance that you would have provided. You can still provide up to that amount of assistance, any amount up to that amount that isn't a duplication of benefits. So if your total need is $100,000 and it would cover everything in your program, and your duplication of benefits is $10,000, and you can just say, well, we can't provide you that last $10,000 worth of assistance, but we can still get you into your house if we provide you $90,000 worth of assistance, even though your need is $100,000. That's okay. You're not duplicating a benefit there. You're just providing up to the amount that's non-duplicative, even though had they avoided the DOB and used their FEMA assistance, for example, for the purpose it was intended, they could have been entitled to a larger amount. So that's the premise there, and I hope, John, I've answered your question.
Thanks, Carrie. And we also just got a general question about these trainings and the materials. So in this series, we are recording all of these training videos, just like some of our past webinars, and they will be uploaded to the HUD Exchange in the training archive. You guys can find this by going to our main website for CDBG-DR and visiting the training portal, and you guys should be able to find this webinar both by the name and date of today's presentation and also through our CDBG-DR Mitigation Summer Series. So you'll have the recording and transcript and slides made available shortly after this. All right. Looking to see our next couple questions. We do have a question just generally about the guidance that HUD gives for securing third-party verifications on insurance payments received by applicants as part of the DOB, especially when it's not related to flooding. So Carrie, Jen, do one of you guys want to take that question?
Yeah, and we can take this one, but it's also, even in a flood disaster, not all insurance will be NFIP assistance, right? So there are countless debates out there about whether damage is caused by wind or flood, and so sometimes it's really easy to get that NFIP flood disaster information from FEMA. But there are all kinds of other insurance payments that might be received by your applicants. And this is a really common question, and it's a challenge, right? The easiest thing to tell you is that you should try two things first. One is, look to see who has a mortgage. Anybody with a mortgage is going to have insurance. And so you just want to look to see, okay, if you've got just put it in your policies and procedures. If you've got a mortgage, you're looking for insurance because it's going to be part of escrow. If there isn't a mortgage, if the home is owned outright, a lot of homeowners do drop their homeowner's insurance or their flood insurance, and they, you might work with insurance is regulated at the state level, so you can work with your state office that regulates insurance companies to see if they can negotiate some data exchanges. But in most cases, that is just it's just hard to do. So that's your second best option. And I think after that, you really just need to be diligent about asking multiple times, and if ask under penalty of perjury and get some signed certifications. Once you've done your due diligence, if it's too difficult to negotiate a big agreement with your state insurance regulator, then you can just ask in the application from the individual. And, you know, there is a risk that you're going to miss some, but hopefully people will see that very scary, you know, fraud alert that and warning you're going to put there, and they are going to respond truthfully.
Thanks, Carrie. And thank you, everyone, so much for your participation today and all of your questions. You know, it's really good feedback on our end to what we need to cover more. So thank you all so much for tuning into our webinar. Please join us on Thursday for our final webinar of this series. And if you have any other follow-up questions, here I'll put it back on the contact slide. But please feel free to contact your CPD representative or send an email with your questions to the policy unit. All right, thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.
Your conference is ending now. As requested by the host, please hang up.